Good morning, friends. A special thank you to Liz Anjos for the wonderful pre-service music. Liz is the daughter of Rod and Rachel Durstein and lives with her husband in Oregon. Welcome to this brief time together as a Salford community before we join the larger circle of our Eastern District and Franconia Conference brothers and sisters for a celebration of Pentecost. Welcome on this day in the church that is so full of promise and hope. Welcome on this day that comes at the end of a week in which we sorely felt our need for promise and hope. How do you come today? A host of possibilities tumbles through my mind as I think about what is happening in the beings of our congregation, because most of those are tumbling through my own being at this time. How do you find yourself? Stunned? Weary? Numb? Filled with grief? Shaken? Heavy-hearted? Impatient? Seeking comfort and respite? This week we have stood witness to some of the depths of human experience. The roll call of names and dates and tiny life snippets of more than 100,000 Americans who have lost their lives to the coronavirus. An ugly, threatening phone call in the midst of the lush greenness of Central Park. The 8-minute police knee hold that led to the death of George Floyd. Protests raging hot and explosive. As anger and fear, violence and systemic injustice, diseases of body and soul spill across our land, we know deep in our hearts our need for the Spirit of God to be poured out upon us and among us. We whisper, we shout, we plead, come, Holy Spirit, come.
Come, O Spirit, come. Come, O Spirit, come. Come, Spirit, come. Spirit, come. Spirit, come. Gift of God, be with us, building us far anew. Gift of God, live within us. Gift of God, now. Gift of God, three yet one, gift of God now come. Veni Spiritus, Veni Spiritus, Veni Spiritus, Veni Spiritus.
As Beth has mentioned, we gather today, some weary, some outraged, some impatient. We are mourning the loss of many, many lives and the relentless harm done to communities of color, evidenced yet again this week. We bring all this and more on this day of Pentecost, this day of holy movement. And today we proclaim that the Spirit of God has come and is here and will come to us again and again. We long for the Spirit to work in us, to fill and shape us into the image of the Jesus that we follow. We long for the Spirit to work in our world, to make visible the reign of God, which often seems so distant and elusive. Whenever I hear the story of Pentecost, I am struck again by how beyond words the Holy Spirit is. Even the images in it, a sound like the rush of wind and tongues of fire, are kind of hard to comprehend. So today, both in our shortened Salford service and in the joint conference Pentecost worship service, which will happen after, there will be lots of different ways to experience the Holy Spirit. We will start with community artwork. Many Salford children and youth have contributed to the project, which you are about to see. So let's watch the progress of this artwork and let's be called into worship as we watch. Do not give easy or unthinking response to this day's call to worship. For today we ask God's Spirit to fill us, that we may prophesy and dream dreams and see visions. The call to worship today is a summons to be touched by holy fire. Even now the flames may dance above our heads, igniting our opinions on peacemaking so that they blaze into commitment. Even now the flames may be burning into our hearts, animating us, leaving us no peace as individuals until God's justice and peace fill the earth as the waters fill the seas. Prophets, visionaries, dreamers, let us all worship with courage and with hope. Let us worship God.
Reading from Acts 2. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above, and signs on the earth below: blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." A tongue rested on each of them, as of fire. We have been promised the Holy Spirit to be poured out upon us, among us, within us. And so this morning we have asked a number of our congregation to speak about how they are seeing God's Spirit at work, moving in these days.
When I think of God's Spirit at work these days, what comes to mind is finding peace and hope throughout these dark times. It's easy for me to get stuck in my pessimistic opinions, but lately I have felt the Spirit challenging those opinions and allowing me to feel peace and hope.
A way I've noticed God's Spirit recently is in our garden. We have rhubarb, lettuces, and strawberries, and they're all flourishing, and they're all delicious.
A way I've noticed God's Spirit recently is by going for walks outside. It's separate from everything else going on in the world, and there's a sense of peace and tranquility that seems to saturate the air out here. It's where I most experience God's presence, and it's energizing and calming and gives me hope.
A way I noticed God's Spirit moving recently was through the amazing contributions of the congregation towards the Eastern District Conference and Franconia Mennonite Conference Shalom Fund, and through the Salford Agape Fund. At a time when the future seems a little unclear and our financial futures sometimes seem insecure, the congregation trusted and had faith in God's Spirit and God's providence that God will provide when times are needed, and was willing to share their finances and their resources with those in the local community and those in the wider community.
Hey, Salford family. When I think about God's Spirit at work today, my mind immediately goes to all of the current events. Of course, we've got a pandemic going on, but in my mind, that pandemic encompasses much more than a virus. It encompasses racism, oppression, hatred, violence, greed, anger, these and many more things. And so when I think about these things, I believe that they're tethered to God's Spirit working. And what brings me hope is that I feel God is working in and through us to accomplish something new, something good. This is the darkness before the dawn, and I'm encouraged to think that God is creating something new, and God is using us to accomplish that. And that brings me a lot of hope. I hope it does you too.
We often sing at Salford that wonderful song, with a question, what is this place? And then we let the poet answer it for us. This is the place where we can receive what we need to increase. One time in the scriptures, we're told of the disciples with Jesus on the mountaintop with Moses and a prophet. And they liked it so much, they said, Master, let's build 3 tabernacles and hang out right here. But they couldn't do that. And now we can't go physically to the place at Salford to get together. And yet, we remember what Jesus told his disciples. He said, when 2 or 3 of you have a relationship together in my name, there am I in the midst. Gertrude Stein once remarked about her birthplace in Los Angeles when she went back to see it, and it had changed so much, she said, there's no there. Well, I find that on Zoom, we have relationship, and there is where Jesus is. So, not only do we have something good, but at the ages of 89 and 90, my wife and I are finding something better. We can hear better now.
Lately, I've experienced God's Spirit in the tension between the miraculous and the unjust. Becoming a mom is something that I cannot take credit for, and a process that I see God move in every day. But I also realize when I look at Caleb that I'm never going to have a conversation with him about how he needs to conduct himself to stay safe in the world because of the color of his skin. And so the Spirit sits with me while I think about a Jesus who performed miracles and also wept and flipped tables.
Holy Spirit, come with power. In just a few moments, it's time to join the Pentecost worship service led by Eastern District and Franconia Conference at 11 o'clock. In order to get there, there were 3 links sent to you. You don't need all 3, but one of the 3 in the email that came with the newsletter this week on Friday. Or if you don't have that nearby and you are on Facebook, just search for Eastern District and Franconia Conference, and that should get you there. If you are not on Facebook, another approach would be to go to the website of Eastern District and Franconia Conference. And now, before we leave this time of being together in this way, I want to read you part of a Pentecost Blessing from Jan Richardson. To bear this blessing, you must first take yourself to a place where everyone does not look like you or think like you, a place where they do not believe precisely as you believe, where their thoughts and ideas and gestures are not exact echoes of your own. Bring your sorrow, bring your grief, bring your fear. Bring your weariness, your pain, your disgust at how broken the world is, how fractured, how fragmented by its fighting, its wars, its hungers, its penchant for power, its ceaseless repetition of the history it refuses to rise above. I will not tell you this blessing will fix all that, but in the place where you have gathered, wait, watch, listen. This is the reason we were made, for this ache that finally opens us, for this struggle, this grace that scorches us toward one another and into the blazing day. May the God of wind and fire, breath and love be with you this day.